Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters.
As US President Joe Biden delivered his annual State of the Union address on Thursday, a ship carrying all the parts required to build a pier was leaving Virginia. It'll travel almost 10,000 kilometres to Gaza, where the pier will be assembled. It's America's latest solution for getting aid into the besieged region, where more than 2 million Palestinian civilians have been left without basic necessities like food, water and medical supplies. US forces have made a series of drops from the air in recent weeks, but it's not enough. The World Food Programme has warned parts of Gaza are on the brink of a famine. The reason is the conflict raging within Gaza. Israel is pounding the tiny region by air and on land in retaliation for a terrorist attack by Palestine's Hamas movement. On October 7, Hamas militants massacred more than 1,100 people in Israel, including scores of children, and took more than 250 hostages. Hamas accuses Israel of blocking the flow of aid, which normally comes in via trucks from a crossing at Rafah on Gaza's border with Egypt. Israel says it's not blocking the aid convoys, but aid agencies say there's been a dramatic fall in the number of trucks getting through Israeli-controlled checkpoints. Israel blames the local United Nations agency on the ground for failing to get the aid to civilians and keep it away from Hamas, which Israel says is using supplies like fuel to bolster its war effort and using civilians as human shields. The United States, as Israel's premier ally and the dominant force in world affairs, is under pressure to resolve this crisis, hence the pier.
No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day. And Israel must do its part.
Israel's Prime Minister is Benjamin Netanyahu, a tough conservative who's become more so over his long career in Israel's tumultuous politics. Netanyahu was deeply unpopular in Israel before October 7, and after a brief surge of support directly after the attacks, he's now facing dwindling popularity. Many Israelis, even those who support the elimination of Hamas's top leadership, are deeply concerned about the return of hostages and worried that Netanyahu's aggressive military strategy is making that return less likely. Now, having swept through Gaza City and Khan Yunis, Israel has indicated it plans to launch an attack on the southern Gaza city of Rafah. It's where more than 1 million Palestinians are now sheltering from the fighting. On Saturday, Biden said that would be a big mistake.
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel.
Biden took aim directly at Netanyahu.
What's happening is he has a right to defend Israel, a right to continue to pursue Hamas, but he must pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost as a consequence of the actions taken. He's hurting, in my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel by making the rest of the world, it's contrary to what Israel stands for. And I think it's a big mistake.
Within a day, Netanyahu fired back, telling Politico he was confused by Biden's comments.
Well, I don't know exactly what the president meant, but if he meant by that I'm pursuing private policies against the majority, the wish of the majority of Israelis, and that this is hurting the interests of Israel, then he's wrong on both counts.
It's the biggest rift we've seen so far since the massacre of October 7, which of course led to the Israel-Hamas war.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent.
The US has been increasingly frustrated with Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. You could see it, tensions have been increasing with every week really over a whole range of issues. The latest one, and the reason why there's such a big rift now, is over the planned ground invasion or ground attack on Rafah. And the Americans don't want the Israelis to have a major ground offensive in Rafah. So that's the immediate dispute between the two leaders, and that's why it's become so inflamed. But it's far more than that, because in recent weeks we've seen a real build-up of tension on a range of issues, and it's just been bubbling and boiling, if you like, and then it just exploded in the last 24 hours.
There's a delicate power balance here, isn't there, Cam, between Israel and the United States? The United States is historically Israel's great patron. It's an article of faith among really both the major political parties in the United States that they support Israel. And yet, in this instance, they clearly can't get Benjamin Netanyahu to pay attention to what they want. What's motivating Netanyahu? He needs American support and American money. How long can he continue to defy America?
Yes, he really does need American support. It's a bit of a dangerous path for Netanyahu to be taking jabs, I think, at the US president, because really Biden and the US administration have been Israel's longest and best friend in this conflict. You know, while a lot of Western countries, including Australia, have fully supported Israel's right to destroy Hamas, there have been increasing questions with a lot of those countries about their levels of civilian casualties. We haven't heard that from the US until the past week. And so Netanyahu is really testing Biden's resolve in this. And Biden also, remember, has some domestic pressure here, because within the US it's an election year, and you've got a situation where opinion polls are slowly turning against Israel's conduct of the war, especially among Democrats. And that's really increasing the domestic pressure on Biden to take a harder line. But it's interesting because Netanyahu from here on has to be careful, I think. He's trying to not lose US support, but at the same time, he's determined to go into Rafah because his political survival will probably depend on it. And he has never wavered from the notion of getting rid of Hamas. The great question, of course, is exactly how he goes about doing that.
It's Ramadan, the holy Islamic month of fasting and reflection observed by Muslims around the world. In recent weeks, Biden was optimistic of an imminent ceasefire before Ramadan.
Yes, they're really in flux. It doesn't look like it's going to happen now. Ramadan's just starting, and Netanyahu is saying he will go into Rafah with a ground offensive. So it looks like that's going to be the situation. And you can't imagine, Claire, under that circumstance, that there's going to be much opportunity to move negotiations forward for the hostages. And any ground offensive in Rafah is obviously extremely dangerous for the hostages, because it's assumed that is where many of them are being hid by Hamas.
Coming up, what about the hostages? You can read all our journalism on this, plus politics, business, sport, and a full breakdown of the Oscars results right now by joining our subscribers at theaustralian.com.au, and we'll be back after this break. Benjamin Netanyahu governs Israel in a coalition of right-wing parties. Israel's always had a vibrant democracy. 10 members of the 120-seat parliament, the Knesset, are Arabs, and there are opposition parties across the political spectrum. Right now, Israel's being governed by an emergency unity government, a bit like a war cabinet, led by Netanyahu and including some of his greatest rivals, like former General Benny Gantz, one of the most influential opposition figures. Netanyahu believes the country is still with him.
So the attempt to say that my policies are my private policies that are not supported by most Israelis is false. The vast majority are united as never before, and they understand what's good for Israel.
Many of the voters abandoning Netanyahu are landing on the centre-right, where figures like Benny Gantz are strongly in support of the war. Polls are showing Gantz as the most popular prime ministerial candidate, and his National Unity Party way ahead of Netanyahu's Likud party. Domestically, Cam, what's the interplay there in Israeli politics? Do you think Netanyahu is going to hold on for as long as he can before calling that election because he knows that he won't win?
Netanyahu is the ultimate political survivor, and he is very happy to manipulate whatever he possibly can to stay in power. That's always been a modus operandi of him. He was very frustrated with Benny Gantz's visit to Washington, which he did not sanction. And it just shows Washington's frustration with Netanyahu. They'd much rather deal with a Benny Gantz than a Benjamin Netanyahu. So I will assume that Netanyahu would continue as long as possible in power, because it's really extremely difficult for him. Once the focus turns off the actual conflict, it will turn immediately to the massive intelligence failure under his watch that led to the October 7 massacre. His coalition is fragile. So it's a very fragmented and fractious coalition. And I think Netanyahu will struggle to stay in power, frankly, much beyond the next election, because I think he's just done so much damage within Israel as well as outside.
As this all unfolds, more than 100 Israeli hostages are still being held captive by Hamas in Gaza. So, are they any closer to freedom? Or is it further away than it's ever been?
I think it's now very tough to get a release for the hostages, at least in the short term. At least certainly if the ground forces go into Rafah. I think in the short term that really makes it difficult. Netanyahu's position has always been you've got to keep going hard at Hamas to get the negotiating position to release the hostages, which may be true, but of course the converse of that is it's very hard to get an agreement when there's actually bitter fighting going on between the warring parties. I think it's very difficult now with the hostages because it's hard to see a window where there would be an agreement, at least in the short term. And of course, the longer we go on, you just have to question how many of these hostages, unfortunately, are still alive, because at least I think 30-odd are known to be dead and still within, being held by Hamas. And surely, as this goes on, especially if there's a ground offensive in Rafah, that number will get ever fewer. So it is a pretty bleak situation, I think, for the hostages in the short term.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. Thanks for joining us on The Front. And to get all the latest news and analysis, subscribe at theaustralian.com.au.